that skyrocketing assessments have had on their properties. And not only on their properties, their communities. Because, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, I was in, as I said earlier, I was in Sheet Harbour, and I listened to the residents in that community down the Eastern Shore speak about what effect non-resident ownership had on their properties. I have listened to some people from Bedeque. I have listened to people on the South Shore, and I've listened to residents on the North Shore as well, through Pictou, Cumberland, in that area as well, Mr. Speaker. And you know, in the community that you represent, the constituency that you represent, you know that a number of people in certain areas of that constituency that you represent, which are beautiful scenic outposts, and those individuals, beautiful scenic communities, I don't want to call them outposts, Mr. Speaker, I better be careful. Beautiful scenic communities. As a matter of fact, I'm not in Australia, so I better be careful. And I'm digging deeper, am I not? But anyway, beautiful hamlets along Nova Scotia that in fact, Mr. Speaker, are that people come in, they gobble up the property, and they squeeze the residents out. Many seniors and many citizens who have lived there all their lives. And Mr. Speaker, although I do know that I still have some more time, I think what I will do is I will exhaust my time now, and at a later date come back after it comes back from law amendments, Mr. Speaker, just after I've heard from the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities, from the residents of Nova Scotia, with respect to this bill, and the member from Cape Breton West, with respect to his comments. And then, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that I will be enlightened and be able to possibly give this bill the passing that it needs, or reject this bill, whatever the case may be. But at least we will be able to have a look at it. And for one thing, I can tell the Minister of Municipal Relations and Service, Nova Scotia, that at least I'm delighted and pleased to see that this bill is on the floor of the Legislative Assembly. Because that's where it should be, and that's where the debate should take place. And I also want to say, once again, Mr. Speaker, before I finish, I want to say that it's because, once again, the persistence of my honourable member from Timberley Prospect and this party who has made that an issue. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and make a number of short interventions on Bill number 40, an act to amend Chapter 23 of the revised statutes of 1989, the Assessment Act. I too, Mr. Speaker, am pleased that this particular piece of legislation is before the House, albeit that not all for the same reasons as the previous speaker. The member from Dartmouth North. Mr. Speaker, I believe that the essence or the focus of the legislation, as I understand through the Minister's opening comments, is to provide a vehicle by which Nova Scotians will not be adversely affected by the forces in the marketplace of rather extensive and high-priced market activities, particularly in counties such as Queens County, Lunenburg County, and Victoria County, these coastal communities, where there has been a considerable amount of pressure.
Order, please. Would the honourable member Cape Breton West allow for an introduction?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Well, honourable members, I take great pleasure in at this time introducing a gentleman who's sitting in the West Gallery. We have with us today Mr. Kevin O'Brien. Kevin was an MLA in Nunavut and was also the Speaker of the Nunavut House of Assembly and Legislature. And he's in Nova Scotia. He has roots here, family here. He's here for a few days visit. And from Glace Bay, thank you, from Glace Bay, Cape Breton. And he's here visiting us today in the legislature, and I hope he enjoys the proceedings. And I ask Mr. O'Brien if you'd stand and receive the usual warm welcome of the House. Thank you. Thank you. The Honourable Member of Cape Breton West has the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too welcome Mr. O'Brien. I'm familiar with his roots, and I suppose too he would be very much known to a former colleague, Mr. Hunter Tutu, who's a very active member in the Nunavik legislature, and I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, you know, I've had the great pleasure of attending several conferences which Mr. Tutu attended and did a great job. Mr. Speaker, with regards to Bill 40, obviously the intent, as I understand, the Minister and the government is trying to protect Nova Scotians from the rather aggressive market forces that have been generated by the demand for coastal pieces of real estate in those counties that I just mentioned. And that is, according to the present Assessment Act, forcing the fair market value of their real estate, local residents, up to a situation where it's almost impossible for them to sustain owning their own property and staying in their own home. Now, one of the cautionary notes that I would put out there, Mr. Speaker, is what the government is intending to do is a very noble gesture, but also it is changing fundamentally the process by which the province is doing real estate appraisals in this province through the fair market value process, particularly, Mr. Speaker, in the real estate market, whether it be residential, commercial, industrial, and in particular, for example, in municipalities such as HRM or CBRM, but mostly HRM, where a lot of developers have apartment complexes and so on, and that has an adverse effect. And I'm not so sure that has been factored into this equation. Most interestingly, Mr. Speaker, is this protection that so long as, for example, a Nova Scotian family does not engage in buying, selling, or trading real estate for the purposes of generating profit or revenues well beyond what the value of the property was initially assessed at. And as has been mentioned by the member for Dartmouth North, what we're doing is we're creating parallel assessment models. The fair market value and the taxable assessment. Now, what happens to the 55 municipalities across the province? What is the impact, Madam Speaker? Well, obviously, the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities has come out foursquare in opposition to this government initiative for a number of reasons, some of which I will outline, Madam Speaker. And it speaks to the comments that were made by the minister's predecessor when he addressed concerns that were raised by the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities, and in particular, local government representatives from Queens County, from Lunenburg County, and from Victoria County. And I'll quote, Madam Speaker, and this is when the present Minister of Health was Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations. And this, Madam Speaker, was, according to this document, and I'll table it, January 27, 2004, in reference to a meeting that the former minister made with regards to these issues. And the minister stated, "No Nova Scotian should be forced from their home due to high assessment increases and related tax burden." And here's what's most interesting, Madam Speaker. Any proposed tax relief provision should not provide a tax subsidy to the wealthy at the expense of other taxpayers. Well, that speaks to the issue that was raised by my colleague from Halifax Clayton Park. Some very well-to-do individuals in this province who take upon themselves to provide considerable improvements to their home, for their real estate, whether it be residential, whether it be a summer cottage. And Madam Speaker, I'm sure you know yourself, there are many individuals in Nova Scotians that have summer cottages that would be considered rather lavish pieces of real estate to others. So this very issue that the minister of the day, who is now the Minister of Health, wanted to ensure that Nova Scotians would be protected on, is now having an adverse effect through this legislation. Here's another provision that seems to be overlooked by this particular piece of legislation, and this was another premise upon which the minister would ensure fairness, that any proposed changes would be acceptable to the majority of municipalities in the province and should not hamper natural growth in municipal revenues. Well, clearly, Madam Speaker, two issues. One, where is the issue of consultation? This government got elected back in 1999 on the premise that it would consult. It was in its Blue Book 1, it was in its Blue Book 2, but yet when they got elected, they became tone deaf to the needs and the aspirations and the rights and the privileges of the municipalities in this province. So where's the cooperation? Where's the consultation? Madam Speaker, it seems to have just evaporated. And the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities recently came out, as recently as January of this year, foursquare against what the government is doing, because there was no full consultation and cooperation on how they were going to achieve this legislation. And the second part of this one statement, Madam Speaker, with regards to the fact that it would not hamper revenue growth for the municipalities. Well, maybe the Minister of Justice, maybe the Minister of Environment and Labour, and yes, maybe the member for Victoria have problems that are unique in their respective jurisdictions. But this is no right, this is not, should not be a license to hamper the other 52 municipalities. And this is what this government is doing. It's trying to be all things to all people, but yet doing nothing. Doing nothing substantive in addressing many key problems in the assessment process of this province and the taxing process vis-a-vis the provincial taxation process and its transfer dollars down to the municipalities, particularly the weaker ones. And that's essentially the same parallel as the federal government vis-a-vis the provinces and the territories. The weaker ones will get cropped up a bit, and the richer provinces will see that transfer of dollars. Much the same parallel in the province of Nova Scotia. It wasn't more than 2 years ago, Madam Speaker, that the government said, we're going to cooperate with the provinces and we're going to proceed with a further exchange of service. We'll continue to do the assessment for the provinces, but we're going to charge them. We're going to charge them, and they have no say on the staffing. They have no say on the administrative rules of engagement or the terms of reference, on the issues of how they determine assessment values. For example, now the most unique characteristics in dealing with assessments in this province now is that if you can see a body of water, you very well may be paying a higher assessment than your next door neighbor who has 2 trees on his lawn. Go down along the Bredor Lakes, and it's happened numerous occasions where someone would live a half a mile or 3/4 of a mile away from the Bredor Lakes, no water frontage, and maybe only a 20-foot access to the number 4 highway, and they're on the off side of the waterfront, and they're being charged higher real estate values, assessment values, than those that have a lot right on the water, because they have a larger lot and they can see the water. And those that are on the water probably can't see the water. Now, Madam Speaker, I've tried to help some constituents on some of these issues, and it defies logic. It defies logic as to what Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations are using in some cases. Not all cases. And I have a little limited knowledge on how this process works. I studied real estate. I sold real estate as a real estate agent, and I've continued well after I've given up my license. So I have a sense of the forces of supply and demand. But I can tell you, Madam Speaker, what the government is attempting to achieve is very noble, but it will create so many problems for just about every municipality in this province that it'll be a nightmare that they want to face going into the next election. And I have no doubts that we'll hear lots about it when it comes before law amendments. I have no doubts. I have no doubts whatsoever. If the government wants to do something, Madam Speaker, the government should be looking at some of the anomalies that are transpiring with some of these municipalities. And yes, even in the one that I reside in. Recently, pieces of real estate being sold without going to public tender, without being called for public proposals. Someone, if they find out the municipality has a piece of real estate, they go and hire an appraiser, go in and say, I want to buy that. Here's my appraised value, and they can purchase it. Now, that is unprecedented in the history of the province of Nova Scotia. And the minister may shake his head on that, but I can attest to it. And maybe he's a little kind of surprised at that, and I am too. And that's no reflection on the bureaucratic process within CBRM. This is a political, this is a policy decision of the municipal government. And then I come here to Halifax, and I listen to this debate going back and forth between the mayor of CBRM and the Minister of Energy, you know, as to who's getting, you know, the upper hand. You know, who's getting the upper hand? The province is saying that we provide you with more benefits on a cash value than you pay in taxes. And CBRM is saying quite the opposite. Well, at least to the minister's credit, he's provided some figures. Some figures. I'm not saying they're right. I'm not saying they're wrong. And I've asked for the figures from CBRM, and to date I have not received them. I've made that request. I didn't engage in the public debate, and I had no intentions of it. I went quietly and I went about my due diligence and said, okay, well, let's find out who's right and who's wrong. Are we getting a fair deal or are we not? Because this has an impact on the budgetary process and how or what the assessed the tax rates are going to be in this fiscal year. And I hear suggestions that the tax rates are going to go up upwards of 4%. We can't afford that in CBRM. So, Madam Speaker, it's incumbent on this government to start looking at some of the structural problems with the municipalities and get back to the table. Maybe this piece of legislation will address all the concerns. I don't know. I'm a little suspect, perhaps a fair bit suspect. I would have a greater comfort level if, in fact, the minister had moved towards the Prince Edward Island model. I really believe that the conditions for non-resident ownership are far more defined in Prince Edward Island. You know, the amount of tenure or the amount of land that you're allowed to own is very restricted, and then you have to build on it if you want to expand and so on and so forth. and there are certain, all the caveats are there, and you pay a higher tax rate. So if you're dealing with Queens County, if you're dealing with Lunenburg County or Victoria County, then yes, this is an issue. But then I've heard arguments say, well, what about my children? They live in Ontario, or they live in British Columbia, or so on. Should they be punished? You know, because they're now outside the province, and if they're outside the province and they want to come home, then my family farm is going to be taxed at that high rate. Well, there are ways to examine that, Madam Speaker. And I don't believe that the government has fully explored that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about hardcore, hard market-driven forces where people from non-Nova Scotia, non-Canadian residency, who have deep pockets are forcing up the market value of real estate in certain parts of the province because it's coastal community. And I think the point has been well made by some of the previous speakers, and in particular, and give credit where credit is due, by the member for Timberley Prospect. He did raise this on several occasions. But I don't think he for one moment expected that this was as complex and as deep and far-reaching as he initially anticipated, because he had a number of constituents that were saying, we're tired of all the waterfront property in our community being gobbled up. And that may be a fair concern, and he has a right to come in and stand up for those constituents. But the total foreign ownership, or non-Nova Scotia, or non-residency ownership of real estate in this province is somewhere, and the minister can correct me on this, I would say 7, maybe 8%. It's certainly less than 10%, province-wide. So that means over 90% of all real estate in this province is owned by Nova Scotians. So we're dealing with a few anomalies that have created some difficulties in some part of the problems, and yes, Madam Speaker, some political problems for a few ministers in that government. So should we turn the whole system upside down? Should we usurp the responsibility away from the municipalities because of this? I don't think so, Madam Speaker. The municipalities are not only paying for the assessment process, which is a provincial responsibility, always has been. Now they're being taxed that's being downloaded, and they have no say in it, and yet they're on the front line when the tax rates come down. If the taxable assessment is locked in, there's no room for them to maneuver. And I'll give you another example of where this has quite an impact, Madam Speaker. What about all the volunteer organizations in this province? What about the community halls? What about the different lodges, whether it be the KOCs or the Masonic lodges or the small community band organizations that are out there doing so much good work? And they don't have enough money to pay these large tax bills because of the ever-increasing assessments. Madam Speaker, there is a provision in the Municipal Government Act that was brought in 1998, Section 160, I believe it is, that allows the municipalities to provide this exemption, and that's great. But here's the sleeper. Here's the sleeper that's now been kicked on them. The total value, the total assessed value of all these pieces of real estate, all these buildings, all these community halls, these lodges, all these charitable organizations are still going to be added up at the end of the day and charged against the total assessed value or transfer dollars to the municipalities. So in other words, the province is saying, you can give the exemption, but don't come back and ask us for a break. So now they're being paid, they have to pay for the assessment, they have to pay they have to pay for any reprieve for all these charitable, these volunteer organizations in the province, from volunteer fire departments to community bands, you name it. And the provincial government is now sticking it to them. Absolutely unconscionable. And the municipalities and the province knows this, do not have the resources to deal with this. There are a few municipalities that have some resources to be able to cope. But it's like what happened in CBRM, Madam Speaker, back in 1995, when the exchange of services went through. Or if we want to go back to 1994, when regional government kicked in, the old municipality of the county of Cape Breton, when it went into this new marriage, was contributing 45% of the total budget for the new CBRM. And now it only gets, in return on its dollar, somewhere in the vicinity of 27%. Before it was getting 100%. So transfer that over to what the province is doing to municipalities like HRM. You can only take so much from your cash cow, and if you don't put it out to pasture or give it some growth, you're going to bleed it dry. And this is what this province is attempting to do through the back door. Madam Speaker, so it may sound great on the surface, and I'm sure that the mayor of HRM will have his say on this, and I'm not so sure he'll agree in totality of what's here before us. No, Madam Speaker, I'm not casting dispersions. I'm putting the facts on the table. We don't want to be like ostriches and bury our head in the sand. We want to face reality. The province has found another way to kind of code over a very serious issue, avoid the difficult issues that have to be addressed, try and score some cheap political points, try and be all things to all people, and then what happens? Yes, it'll be Hants County, it'll be Kings County, it'll be Lunenburg County, it'll be Queens, it'll be Yarmouth, it'll be Cumberland County, the Outreaches, Argyll, you name them, all 55 of them, Madam Speaker, are going to pay the piper for this piece of legislation. And I think that's not right. This bill does have some potential, it has merit, but restrict it to what the problem was initially set out for in these target areas. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, or the whatever acronym you'd like to use, or analogy, I'm sorry. The legal mind to my right is far more I don't know if eloquent. He's far more learned in the language than I am. But pardon? Yeah. Yes, Madam Speaker. This legislation restricts. It doesn't provide the flexibility. It doesn't provide the flexibility that's required. And it drives a stake right through the entire process of fair market value and operations in this province. It kind of a bit of a contradiction in terms. It's more than an oxymoron, because you have a right-wing government interfering with market forces to try and solve a very localized issue. But 1 in 10, Madam Speaker, he hits on the nail. but Madam Speaker,
I think he wants you to talk about their flyers there, Russell. That's what you guys need to do.
Madam Speaker, it's too early in the session to engage into any emotional rabbit tracks. But this is a very serious issue. It's a very serious issue. How will the municipalities be able to set their budgets if the province is going to be holding this card over their head? Can we go with fair market value, or can we not? Now, Well, let's look at those municipalities where you don't have those spikes in the market activity because of non-residency, non-Canadian acquisitions, buys and sells. Well, I'll give you some example just in CBRM in Richmond County. There's a tremendous amount of activity in the real estate market from individuals moving from the German from the country of Germany, and that's great. The activity that's been generated in both these counties, both these municipalities, has been good. They've been able to generate tax dollars to be able to help the weaker and the less fortunate in these municipalities that don't have the resources, those on low and fixed income, who do, particularly if they're receiving the supplement, will be able to get some tax relief from the province. Now, what impact is this legislation going to have on that? Because the province has now moved into not just the assessment process, but it's now moved into the tax rate issue. Not overtly, but through the back door, this province is now dictating to the provinces in a more restrictive fashion what the tax rates of their municipality should be. Now, at the rate they're going, they're going to take over total management of the financial activities of the municipalities in this province. They'll be, like in some provinces, they'll be moving to reduce the total number of municipalities so dramatically, it would really scare you. But yet, if you look in Pictou County, I've heard concerns raised by several of the municipal units that one municipal unit has done so well on the revenues from the offshore, from the pipeline, that they have a rather significant little nest egg. And the member for Pictou East says, good for them. West, I'm sorry. Whatever. But I'm sure he would be the same member to stand up and say, you know, we should have fairness and equity. What about regional cooperation? Shouldn't there be just one tax rate in Pictou County? He has real estate background. He knows all about, you know, how the market goes. He knows that the population overall in Pictou County is shrinking, that the number of young people in that municipality is shrinking. He knows that the number of people that are unemployed in that county has increased. He knows a lot of things, but he does not speak to these. And they have a direct impact, Madam Speaker. They have a direct impact on the tax rates. And they have a direct impact on the assessed value of the real estate in that county. Now, these are serious structural problems that contribute to many of the frustrations because of a lack of a cooperation that he's always coming before this House and saying that we should have. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Start in your own backyard, I always say. That's why I didn't have any problem standing on the issue in '94 on regional cooperation. I didn't have any problem taking a stand on the exchange of services in '95, albeit that not a lot of people agreed with me, and that's fine. But I was proven right in the end, Madam Speaker. There was a significant tax hit to that municipality, but for the wrong reasons. And I would suggest in Pictou County, that problem will surface. That dragon will rear its head, not too far off.
The honourable member allow for an introduction? Thank you. The honourable member from Guysborough Sheet Harbour would like to make an introduction.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member from Cape Breton West for allowing me to do this. In the West Gallery, through you, Madam Speaker, and to all members of the House, we have with us the Warden for the Municipality of the County of Antigonish, Mr. Herbert Delory. We also have the Clerk Treasurer for the County of Antigonish, Alan Bond. I'd like to the House to give them their usual warm welcome.
Certainly, we welcome them to the gallery and hope that they have an interesting time while they're here. And back to the honourable member from Cape Breton West.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I too would like to welcome our municipal colleagues. It's a very timely visit, as they well know, with this piece of legislation before the House, and I'm sure that in due course they and/or their representatives will have an opportunity to speak to this legislation. And it's rather fitting because the member who made the introduction, he himself has quite a quandary in his own constituency with what is happening to the town of Cancel. This municipal unit is in a crisis situation. And what's being done? What's being done? What's being done by the province when the assessment continues to shrink? You know, it's a reverse situation. It's a reverse problem. You know, what's the province doing there? What intervention is being there or contemplated through Bill 40 to address those types of problems? This legislation has not been thoroughly thought out. The intent is noble. I will give the minister credit. It's noble, but it's very localized. It's very localized. And the more I think about it, the more the dots and the dashes and the lines just keep connecting, and we keep coming back to Lunenburg, Queens, and Victoria. So, Madam Speaker, there's some of the concerns that I have. And the former Minister of Municipal Affairs, the now Minister of Health, he was quite adamant. He was quite adamant about this cooperation between the various stakeholders. In fact, here's one of the primary concerns that were raised by UNSM. Altering assessments from a market value system creates inequities by allowing subsidization of certain properties by all other property owners. That's the bottom line. There's only so much money in the kitty. There's only so much money to be had. I recall back in 1973 appealing a tax assessment and going before the appeals board because I felt that I was over-assessed. I wasn't going to go because I was under-assessed. I mean, not too many people do that. And it seemed like a lot of money to myself at the time. It was a small piece of real estate, I think assessed at maybe about $5,000. And I said, well, that's way too much because way out in Grand Mire, can't afford that kind of money. Nobody will pay $5,000 for a lot. If you get $2,500 back then, you were doing well. Well, yes, I've sold some real estate worth a little more than that in that area. But the issue being, at the hearing, the most interesting comment was made by the adjudicator. He said, do you not know one of the primary purposes of assessment? Well, I said, yes. I said, I think it's to determine what your land is worth. He said, that's true, but it's much more. He said, the province has a total assessed value, and they use that total assessed value in helping to balance their books, to determine what the value of the provinces is, so as to be able to go before the bonding agencies to know what its credit rating is going to be. And then all this trickle-down effect. Ergo, a poor little lot in Grand Mire was part of some international equation from the bonding agencies in New York. Now, I don't really know if that was 100% correct or not, but that's what I was told. And it does seem to make sense when you see what the province is doing to the municipalities through this piece of legislation. if the province was intending to charge the municipalities with the responsibility of assessments, why not the collaborative effort? All it is just a chargeback. We're Big Brother. We're going to tell you you're now paying for this service because we want to balance our books or we want to get money from some other source. So that's exactly as I see what's happening. We see what's happening here in HRM with this freeze on development and the impact. Now you're going to hear lots of arguments, and I don't know all the dynamics, Madam Speaker, because I don't engage in on a daily basis the the details of development in HRM, although I am a little bit familiar. You have the non-serviced versus the service areas, and the long-term plans and the short-term plans and so on. And the total number of lots, I think, that are being built on in the run of a year, I think is somewhere 600, maybe 600 or 800. I'm not sure the exact number. I saw the report. I'm just going by memory. It's quite considerable. So that's a rather significant rate of development. Can you imagine if that were taking place in Cumberland County or Yarmouth or Queens or down in Colchester County even? That would be a tremendous amount of growth. So things are growing so fast in HRM, they're trying to put some coolers, slow things down so they can get control. But while they're doing that, HRM has made, in its wisdom, a policy decision to develop a long-term plan, whether we agree with it or whether we don't. You have to give them full credit for providing the insight to develop that plan that they feel is in the best interest of all the citizens and the businesses of HRM in the long term. So with that in mind, you have to recognize that. They've made that conscious decision, which in the short term is going to cost them money because they're restricting development. It's slowing things down. I know there's a resource pool there of X number of lots that are developed and so on, but it won't take long for that to be gobbled up, Madam Speaker. But they're making the right decisions, and what's happening, as soon as they turn their head away from the provincial government sticks it to them. And what happens at the end? Who are the three main winners? Queens County, Lunenburg County, Victoria County. Localized issues. Not discounting the need to address the serious concern that was raised by the member for Timberlake Prospect on a number of occasions about foreign ownership, if you want to use it in that context. It's not as severe as he's got it made out to be in localized situations. Yes, that may be, there may very well be some anomalies. There's legislation on the books, Madam Speaker, that has never really been acted on, and that is to require people from outside the province, when they purchase, or if you sell land to non-resident owners, then there's a requirement to register that with the province. That's never really been acted on. That piece of legislation's been on the books since the days of Premier Gerald Regan. Madam Speaker, one of my colleagues would also like to do an introduction.
Thank you. The honourable member from Preston would like to make an introduction.
Thank you very much, and thank the Speaker for interrupting his speech there. We have two young men in the gallery, in the West Gallery, that are from the 5th Dartmouth Scout Troop, Ian Morrison and Victor Bagnall, and just come this evening to see what the legislature is all about. And I'd ask you to give them a warm welcome to the legislature.
Back to the honourable member from Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to go back to the issue of Pictou County and show why I think this this patchwork approach to this rather large, and it is a complex problem, is just not working for the provincial government. You know, the way that the assessment issue has been dealt with regards to the transmission line for the natural gas has benefited certain stakeholders, and other stakeholders have been completely shut out altogether. Much akin to what happened in 1991 when the Crown Corporation, referred to as Nova Scotia Power Corporation, was privatized. There were a number of significant policy changes that took place at that time. Number one was the elimination of the Rural Electrification Act. That has had an adverse effect across this province like I have never seen before. And for those who aren't familiar, what some of the benefits, one of the key benefits of that was, Madam Speaker, is the fact that, for example, ribbon development out along, let's say, Road X in Hants County. You're driving down Road X and you come to the last home, and that's where the power would end. But if someone wanted to build 3/4 of a mile down the road beyond the service, he couldn't get power. But if two of his neighbors or friends or family were to build 2 other homes with him, the power would be extended for that additional mile. That was incorporated. There would be no direct charge. It was all part of the overall coverage. Now, when Nova Scotia Power was privatized, that was done away with. So if you built a mile away from the service, or let's say a half a mile, you had to pay for every pole, you have to pay for every foot of line, and so on and so forth. It was designed to force development out of rural Nova Scotia by the Premier of the day from Pictou County. That had a major negative impact. But not only that, but they changed the distribution of wealth on this grant in lieu of taxes. One time, it went to all, I think it was 66, was it 66 municipalities at that time? I believe so. 65 or 66, province-wide. And now, where does it go? You know, or no, I'm sorry, it was reversed. Wherever the assessed real estate was, that's what it was. I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, I had the things reversed. But now it's distributed province-wide. So you take on Cape Breton Island, where 50% of all the total tangible assets are for Nova Scotia Power, what do they get? They get a pittance. They get a pittance. And what does the province do in lieu of that? Another provincial Big Brother intervention. And I would submit, we're going to see more of this. It will resolve some of those problems in those coastal communities, in those municipalities. It will alleviate some of the political problems for the Minister of Justice and for the Minister of Environment and Labour, and yes, for concerns in Victoria County. But it'll create, I will submit, that it will create many more problems than it will solve. And I'd be very surprised if the various stakeholders, particularly representatives from municipal units across this province, don't come and have something to say about it. Particularly after what happened with the distribution of the resources in Pictou County and so on with regards to the pipeline. It's a double standard. It's an absolute double standard. So, you know, maybe there is some lobbying going on that we don't know about. Maybe there are some stakeholders that we haven't identified in this equation. But this is an intervention without complete thought as to what the implications are. And with those comments, Madam Speaker, I'll draw my comments to a close, and I'll be looking forward to hearing the presentations at law amendments, and hopefully when this bill comes back before the House, if it's not completely revamped or incinerated or whatever the words would be at that process, I'd be looking forward to perhaps some, obliterated, eviscerated. We'll be looking for perhaps some amendments here as it comes back to committee of the whole. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member from Halifax-Chebucto.
This bill plants no trees. At the very best that can be said for it is that perhaps it clears away a little bit of the underbrush. It's the sort of legislation that we would like to support, and yet we take, I think, a broader view of what it is that is the problem. Indeed, I think the basic difficulty with Bill 40 is that it takes up one small piece of a much larger problem, and indeed it's not so obvious that it deals with that small piece in any effective way. For we have to ask ourselves what indeed is the objective of this bill. What exactly is it that it is trying to accomplish? It is not so obvious. I will suggest that there are probably 7 or 8 different problems that are bound up together that have to be considered, that are perhaps only partially addressed or not addressed at all in this bill. I want to list them, and then I want to move through each of the list and say a few words about them in relation to what it is that the bill either attempts to do or omits to do. So the first problem is this question of fairness to individuals. Now, it seems that this is the basis on which the bill is put forward, and I'll get back to this. And I suppose an allied way of thinking about this question of fairness to individuals is to think about the open operation of the marketplace and whether it ought to be changed or interfered with in some way. Those 2 points might be seen together. But along with that is the problem of access to land, especially access to coastal land, because that's very much a problem that we have dealt with in this legislature. Indeed, our party has led the way in terms of bringing up issues around that. And that's part of what it is that this bill has to do with. It can be seen as well as trying to deal with a general problem of inflation, and I suppose that's another way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about the problem is the difficulty of ability to pay on the part of individuals who are faced with property tax bills that they think are beyond their means. And that's a real issue. All of these are real issues. There's the issue of overall fairness in the tax system. That is, fairness in the property tax system. And that's a real issue. There's the question of the appropriate economic use of land. That's a real issue. There's the problem of appropriate levels of revenues for local government. And that too, of course, is a real issue. So all of these are issues that the minister in his area of responsibility as a member of the cabinet should be contemplating, should be dealing with, should be thinking about. And it's not as if these various problems are new or have not been identified before. They're regularly identified, they're regularly put in front of the minister, and indeed, his own government generated a report a few years ago through voluntary planning that examined a number of these associated issues. What we have to remember about that is that the voluntary planning report didn't just deal with one narrow part of the range of issues that are implied in this question of property taxation. And yet this bill does. Even though we have many criticisms to make of the report that voluntary planning did, we nonetheless recognize that they did quite a good job of identifying a whole host of problems that have to be looked at. And yet the minister has brought in in front of the House a bill that is so narrowly focused that we have problems in understanding exactly what it's about. Now, our instinct, as I said, is to want to support this kind of legislation because it deals or touches upon the array of problems that we have spoken about often in this House. My colleague, the member for Timberlea Prospect, has undoubtedly taken the lead in identifying a problem in the coastal communities of Nova Scotia. That problem has been variously described. In some terms, it's been described as the problem of non-resident ownership. In some areas, the language has been the problem of access to our coasts. In some areas, the problem has been described as one of unfairness to individuals in their ability to pay tax bills. Now, all of these things are bound up together. And all of these are problems that we should be grappling with. All of these are problems that have not gone away. If anything, these problems have increased over time. If we look back at recent history, we know that there was at least some awareness in the province of Nova Scotia as early as 1970 about the problem that was then regarded as one of non-resident ownership of land. And we know this because in 1970, this House passed something called the Land Holdings Disclosure Act. That was a piece of legislation that was prompted by identification of the phenomenon of non-resident ownership and the beginnings of some worry that this might be having adverse economic impacts or adverse social impacts on Nova Scotians. The piece of legislation that was brought in took a very modest step. All it did was put an obligation on a non-resident purchaser to report that fact. Indeed, it extended the obligation to lawyers involved in the transaction. And I can recall that in those years practicing law, I filled out forms that were specified under this legislation in which, if I acted for a non-resident client, I would have to report the fact that land had been purchased in Nova Scotia by a non-resident owner, the type of land, and the amount, the size of the land. But all that was required in the legislation was generation of this information. There were no penalties, there were no extra taxes, there were no restrictions. All the bill was doing was seeking, on behalf of the government, to gather information. But this was 1970, and it's clear that because that step was taken, there was at least some level of awareness that there was a problem. Well, here it is, almost 35 years later, and we're still tinkering with this problem in a very small way. The problem has not gone away. The problem has only increased decade after decade. Now, one of the things that the report that was done by Voluntary Planning, the committee that Mr. Jim Moyer chaired, in its report called Non-Resident Land Ownership in Nova Scotia, what they did was they tried to put together some solid data about what the non-resident ownership situation is. And it was very difficult for the committee to do that. Indeed, I have heard the solicitor for the Department of Natural Resources, I believe it was, speak about the information that has been gathered under that legislation, the Land Holdings Disclosure Act. She said that for a long time, that information wasn't really compiled into any statistical tables, that she was obliged to go back and try and search through old reports that had been filed by lawyers on behalf of their clients over the years to see what she could generate. And then she was also obliged to try to look at the addresses in the tax bills, or in the assessment rolls rather, that were in the knowledge of the province. She readily agreed that these were imperfect instruments in terms of gathering statistical information. But even on the basis of that, she was suggesting, and I think Mr. Moyer's committee accepted, that there seemed to be some indicators that in some provinces, in some counties rather, there are serious problems about non-resident ownership, particularly along the coast. The counties that were identified are Digby, Annapolis, and Shelburne. In those counties, according to the voluntary planning report, non-resident ownership approaches 30% of the coastline. Now that's a lot. If this is a problem, then that problem has to be dealt with. Now, why might it be a problem? Now, clearly, we cannot be xenophobic here. This isn't a question of prejudice against people who live in other nations. This should not be a question of prejudice against people who live in other parts of Canada. If there's a problem, the difficulty is that land is probably not being used in a way that might be to its best economic advantage for those of us here in Nova Scotia. Let me give you an example. If land that might be used productively for agricultural purposes is acquired as a recreation property that is in use 2, 3, or 4 months a year, then that land has changed its character of use. And when a person lives in a summer home for 2, 3, or 4 months a year, they might be injecting some money into the local economy, but it's for a limited purpose and for a limited period of time. If that land were better used year-round for agricultural or other purposes, then the community, the local community, those of us who live here in Nova Scotia, might well be better off. This is general economic activity that might be generated. And I'm not saying that people who live outside the province or live outside the local county or local municipality who come for the summer aren't an economic benefit. Clearly, there's some economic stimulus. They might have built their home and used local builders to do it. They might have used local materials, and probably they did. They probably purchase things locally, food and so on, when they're there. But it's for a limited period of time. And this is just meant to illustrate part of the problem of non-resident ownership. Now, other provinces have tried to deal with this. Other provinces, PEI as a leading example, have put limits on the amount of land that non-resident owners can acquire. And they particularly put limits on land that they regard as, of types of land that they regard as being very important for their economy. And in PEI, that means coastal property because of the tourism implications. And in PEI, it also means agricultural land because of the importance of agriculture to their economy. These have been challenged in court. These restrictions have been challenged in court, but unsuccessfully. So it's possible to frame legislation in a way, as PEI did, that would withstand the scrutiny of the courts. Other provinces and PEI have done different things. One of the things they've done is they've put a differential tax system in place. So non-residents have to pay a greater amount of taxes, or, as they phrase it in the legislation, residents pay less or get a rebate on their taxes compared with non-residents. PEI is not the only province that has done this. Quebec has done it. I think British Columbia has done it. At least one other province, I believe Ontario did it for a number of years, although I think it's since abandoned the system. Point is that this mechanism does exist if we consider that this is a problem and we want to do something about it. Now, the voluntary planning task force recommended against a special tax for non-residents on land. Well, you can argue the toss, but they didn't say that there wasn't a problem. They recommended against this particular mechanism, but they didn't say that there wasn't some kind of problem that we should think about. Unfortunately, the government doesn't seem to have worked their way through this problem and brought us a solution. This is not going to end the problem. What does this bill say about non-resident ownership and the appropriate economic use of land? It does nothing really to nudge land use towards its highest and best purpose. It's focused very narrowly on this question of fairness, apparently, to individual owners of property. So although this is the kind of bill on the kind of topic that we might want to support, we look at it and the first failing that strikes us is this question of best economic use of land. It just doesn't engage with that issue. Nor does it engage with the next point I want to turn to, which is revenues for local government. This act clearly has potential for causing some problems in terms of the revenue flows to local governments. Now, we know that the Union of Nova Scotia Municipality has said that it is not in support of this bill. I believe that one of the reasons the UNSM is having difficulty supporting this legislation is in part because they can anticipate that their members, the municipalities of the province of Nova Scotia, are going to encounter some difficulties in terms of their revenue flows. We have to remember that local governments have a vast array of powers that they are asked to exercise, and yet at the same time, they are the level of government in Canada that have the least flexible tools to generate revenues. They are the level of government that is most dependent on transfers from other levels of government. Just think how dependent we as a province are on transfers from Ottawa. But municipalities are even more dependent generally on transfers from the provincial level or some form of break from the provincial level. They have a wide array of powers, and yet they have very limited taxing ability. The taxing ability that they do have is focused virtually exclusively on the land tax, on the property tax. This is difficult. They can bring in certain user fees, but they don't like to do that, and indeed user fees are, of course, generally regressive. Property taxes are regressive. That's problematic enough. But municipalities really are in a bit of a corner when it comes to dealing with their revenue situation. And this bill isn't going to make things necessarily better for them. Now, I want to point out that this question of increasing assessments and therefore difficulties for owners is not one that's limited to rural areas. Urban areas experience this in the same way. Let's be clear about that. There has been enormous increase over the last couple of decades in the market price of property in the central urban core of HRM. And this is obviously one of the most desirable places to live for those of us who want to live in Nova Scotia full-time. And because of the physical arrangement of the peninsula and where it is that the attractive destinations are, land values have gone up for any property that's located within easy transportation distance of the central core. The government buildings are here, the universities are here, the hospitals are here, the professionals have most of their offices here, the entertainment facilities are here. Those are big draws. The jobs are here. That's an important draw. So people want to be able to travel into the central core or live on the central core, even better. So property prices have gone up enormously. And I can remember when I was a municipal councillor and more latterly as a member of this legislature, receiving outraged calls from many people who live in my constituency and who lived in my municipal district about the increases in their assessments, because they saw enormous increases in their tax bills year over year. This is not a problem that's...
Would the honourable member allow for an interruption for an introduction?
Would, yes.
The honourable member from Cape Breton Nova.
Here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, colleague. I would like to introduce to all members of the House, members of the NSGEU's Civil Service President's Council, representing 5,600 provincial government employees. In the East Gallery, Wanda Pulsifer, Carol Ann McKenzie, Guysborough County, Barbara Larad, Cape Breton, Wayne Butler, Pictou, Brad Crew, Colchester County, David Brewster, Annapolis Kings and Hants County, Wayne Sitland, HRM, Susan Kidston, HRM, Carol Ann Gadet, Yarmouth and Digby. They are here to talk with the MLAs this evening about pressing civil service issues such as amendments to the Civil Service Collective Bargaining Act, legislative whistleblowing protection, and the 1% premium increase for the public service pension plan. Here they are in the East Gallery up here this evening. I'd like to have a warm welcome. Thank you.
Welcome, and I hope you have an interesting stay here this afternoon or this evening. The Honourable Member from Halifax, Chebucto.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was pointing out that this problem of increases in assessments is one that is not confined to rural areas. This is every bit as much a problem in urban areas as it is a problem in rural areas. I don't want members of the House not to think that's the case. I don't want members of the House to forget that for a moment. So this is, in many respects, then, a province-wide problem. And it's not tied exclusively, then, to non-resident ownership. It's a problem that can be seen as having, as being tied to general inflation. Now, if this problem is tied to general inflation and to the competitive factors in the marketplace, then what exactly is it that the minister is saying to us he's going to do about this? Is he saying that he's prepared to bring in anti-inflationary legislation? That seems to be what's going on. Is he saying that what he thinks is that the operation of the marketplace is somehow gotten out of control? I'm not saying that any of that would be objectionable if the minister were inclined to try to do that. And indeed, I'm happy to have some kind of precedent that we could point to on future occasions that would remind us of the inclination of the government to interfere in an appropriate case when the marketplace is not operating properly. And yet, what is the trigger? What is it exactly that the minister is saying is an unacceptable level of increases? We don't know. No number has been attached to this. At one point, when the federal government brought in anti-inflation legislation, they talked about 6 and 5. They thought that was the appropriate cap, and what provoked it was inflation at 13%. Those are historic numbers in Canada, but maybe those aren't the triggers that the minister has in mind. And if the minister is thinking of setting a cap, a trigger that's somewhere much higher than those numbers, then what's the number? And will it do anyone any good? Suppose, for example, that the minister had in mind a cap that would only apply when changes year over year exceeded, say, 25% or 50%. Now, those would be big numbers. The kinds of increases that we've mostly seen in the urban areas have been year over year inflationary increases, 5%, 10%, maybe 15 or 20%. But if the minister has in mind larger numbers, then it seems to me that he's not going to be helping the people in the urban areas that have this same problem. And if you think about it for a moment, it's easy to recognize that there has been an enormous increase in the urban areas as a general fact of life. People have seen their home values on the open market double over the last decade easily in the central core and in some areas beyond that. If there's a 7 to 10% increase per year, it takes less than a decade to double land values, which means often that the tax bills go up, perhaps not by that full amount, but they certainly increase. HRM has done a good job, its council, in a few years of holding the line on the tax rate, but at the same time, their overall expenditures have gone up. and people have found that their tax bills have gone up quite a bit to the point where it's very hard for them to manage to keep their homes, to pay those bills. It's not just in rural areas that there are people who have difficulty with the ability to pay their real property taxes. And yet, if the minister has in mind a very high cap, then surely he's focusing very narrowly on one small group of owners in the province. So why would the minister not tell us the numbers? Why isn't the minister telling us what regulation he has in mind to bring in? We could debate this more intelligently if we heard details of the number the minister has in mind. And I suspect, unfortunately, that what the minister has in mind is a very high number. And the higher the number, the fewer the people, the fewer the property owners who are going to be beneficially affected by this legislation. In other words, it's all for show, or it's directed at a very few number of beneficiaries around the province. This is not tackling a real problem that's out there. This is, in fact, pretending that you're tackling a problem. That is not fairness to individuals. It's not fairness to the community at large. It doesn't deal with revenues to local government in a way. It doesn't deal with the land use issues. It just doesn't deal with the full array of questions that are raised as soon as you begin to think about property taxation. Property taxation is a complex issue. This bill fails to generate the full range to engage with the full range of issues. So that's problematic. However much this is the kind of topic and therefore the kind of bill that we would like to support, it's difficult. I mean, our inclination is to want to support it, and yet so much is left out. Let me talk about ability to pay just a little bit, because if that's what the minister has in mind, there are, of course, other ways of dealing with that question, and one of them has to do with tying municipal revenues, which I spoke to before, to revenue. That is, going back to looking at some kind of income tax system. Now, it's not a well-known fact because many of us haven't experienced it in our adult lifetimes, but prior to 1941, when the federal and provincial governments entered into a new taxation agreement across this country for wartime purposes, that survived the war, of course, it was the case that many municipalities in Canada had an income tax. Now, income tax is not perfect, but it is a much more progressive tax than property tax. Property tax is a regressive tax. It means that you have to pay it regardless of your ability to pay. Consider a two-income family living in the family home. Now, they clearly have the greatest ability during their revenue-producing years to pay their property taxes than they'll ever have. At some point, they retire. When they retire, their income goes down, but they could still be living in the same family home. And they're still being asked to pay property taxes on that home, and year after year, of course, there's an inflation in the value of that land on the marketplace, and they still have to pay that property tax, although their revenues have gone down. And now imagine what happens if one of those spouses were to die. Revenues go down again. And yet the surviving spouse could still be living in that family home, and indeed we want that person to continue living in that family home so long as they're physically able to. Why not? So they should. And yet family revenues have gone down again. The property value has increased yet again, as it does year after year, and they still have to pay the property tax. Not they, this one person has to pay the property tax. Now, if the minister wants to deal with ability to pay, if that's his concern, if that's his core concern is ability to pay, then he should take a more creative way of thinking about the question of ability to pay and property tax. There are lots of models out there. There are lots of articles out there. I'm sure the minister's staff would be happy to point him in the direction of articles in tax journals that would tell him alternatives that he might want to consider. Now, what about the issue of fairness in the overall property tax system? Now, I can imagine the minister sitting in his office saying to himself, "Oh my goodness, there are problems in the property tax system. Let me consider a variety of ways in which the property tax system in our province is inequitable." Well, if that's what the minister did, and somehow in his reading of the Assessment Act he chose to fasten on to this problem, he hasn't got his priorities straight. Because anyone who reads the Assessment Act will immediately realize that there are any number of inequities, unfairnesses, peculiarities, historic accretions that have found their way into our Assessment Act and that could usefully be dealt with. This bill picks out only one small item. It's an interesting item. It's one that we'd like to support if we felt that somehow there were a convincing rationale and that somehow maybe it's the first of 5 or 6 bills that might rationalize our Assessment Act and the property tax system. But I don't think so. I haven't heard the minister say that. No hint from the minister that he has 6 more bills in his back pocket that he's going to bring in to straighten out some of the anomalies of the Assessment Act. Nope, not there. So again, here's another peculiarity about this bill. I mean, I find it very odd to see what it is that the minister really has in mind. Now let me turn to one other aspect which one would have thought was so closely bound up with the question of rural properties and their increase in value that the minister would have dealt with it. Now I take it, the reason I arrive at this is that I take it that the minister really is focused not on urban areas here. He's really focused on a few select rural areas in Nova Scotia. And I'm not saying there isn't a problem there. There is a problem there. But part of that problem is access to our coastal areas. Now, again, if he wants to go back and read the Voluntary Planning Task Force report, he'll find that a lot of the recommendations that are in that task force report deal with questions of public access to the waterfront, to the coast. This is a real problem, and it's not purely tied to non-resident ownership. It is in part, but not purely. It's tied to development along the coasts. It can be tied to gated communities. Let's take an example about gated communities. They don't have to be non-resident ownership at all. We have several examples of gated communities in Nova Scotia. In fact, countrywide, we've managed to identify about 240 of them in a recent study. This is a growing problem in Canada as a method of land ownership. And it's designed to keep people out. That's what the gate and fence are all about. It's designed to keep people out of prime property. Fox Point is an example in Nova Scotia. There are others in HRM. These communities have been allowed to develop, and they've been allowed to develop without any policy direction from the provincial government that tells municipalities that they shouldn't allow them. And if they haven't arrived at that policy view yet, then at least they might initiate a discussion. They might invite municipalities to say what they think about it. They might invite planners to say what they think about it. They might invite the public to say what they think about exclusive gated communities that keep people out. This is a problem that's growing in Nova Scotia. We ought to nip it in the bud before it turns out to be even more extensive a problem than it is already. But does this bill engage with that issue? It does not. Does this bill deal with the things that Jim Moyer and his Voluntary Planning Task Force pointed out could be dealt with by the provincial government? Does it set aside more money for the province to buy recreational land? Does it give greater guarantees for citizens of Nova Scotia, for residents, to be able to have access to coastal properties? It does not. Does it clarify the legal situation around access to coastal areas? It does not. All we have to do is recognize that our legal framework right now has quite a number of weaknesses that could have been engaged with.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Halifax-Chebucto has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I regard this as much more pressing an issue than the narrow focus of the bill. Now, as I say, as soon as the minister comes with something that deals with land in Nova Scotia, I'm interested. When the minister comes with something that deals with taxation around land in Nova Scotia, our caucus is very interested. As soon as the minister comes with legislation that he suggests somehow solves the problem of rising taxation, non-resident ownership, inequities to people, it's the kind of thing that we would like to support. And yet, when we look at this bill and compare it with the range of problems that is truly at work here, we have to have our doubts. Mr. Speaker, I think virtually everyone in the opposition who has spoken to Bill 40 has indicated that we are highly desirous of hearing what it is that presenters will say to us at law amendments. And I want to agree with that. I put myself among that number. I indeed want to hear what people say at law amendments, because I bet that they will point out that there are difficulties here. They will point out that a real problem exists, but that this bill doesn't quite engage. It only begins to engage with the full range of problems that we have to deal with. So, in due course, I guess we'll get the chance to look at this again in more detail. And I'm happy that's the case. But I think the minister has to be put on notice as a result of my comments, as a result of the comments of the member for Timberlea Prospect, of the result of the comments of the member for Dartmouth North, and indeed as a result of the comments from the members of the third party, that there are problems here that have not been dealt with adequately. So I ask the minister and his caucus to think again and think more seriously about the problem that they're inviting us to grapple with here. They've opened a door, they've given us a little peek at the problem, but this isn't something that they're going to be able to close the door on so easily. It's not such a simple problem. It's a complex problem. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I won't speak as long as my the previous colleague, and perhaps not quite as eloquently either. But I do have some concerns that I'd like to raise, and actually I would say I've never been a municipal councillor. My entry into politics was purely to run for this party, and the constituents in my area were certainly willing enough to put their faith in me once, twice, and 3 times. So, but I want to say that as someone who lives in a fairly rapidly growing area, part of the province, and in particular lives on a farm that's been in my family for over 100 years, and along with that borders a lake. So this is an area, as you can well expect, is one that has become more and more attractive over the years. That people are interested in settling around the lake, and for sure we've had the experience of non-resident ownership in that area, and in particular on a very large parcel of property on that lake, which I know to some extent has affected the assessments of property in that area. And as much as I appreciate the points that my colleague who previously spoke has raised, the member from Halifax Chebucto, I'm not sure that with this government that we can expect to get anything that would even come close to addressing all the issues that he has raised. And actually, it would be really nice if actually that were the case. But what I'm hoping is that this piece of legislation will at least address the concerns that have been raised by residents in areas to all members of the House in whatever part of the province, and in particular my colleague from Timberley Prospect, who has kind of led the fight on this issue. It's probably quite true that this is not wide-ranging enough, and I actually think that it can address the issues that the number one issue that really has come to us, and that is the fact that people have been forced into situations where their traditional properties have had such enormous assessments due to a non-resident moving in beside them, that it has made it difficult for them to maintain ownership of their property. And I'm not entirely convinced at this point that this piece of legislation will actually address that problem, because there's still information that we don't have, and that is in the percentage of the cap. Without knowing at what level the cap will be capped, it's pretty difficult to know whether there will be much benefit for landowners generally. And certainly if the cap is allowed to be, I would say even if it was 20% seems high to me. We're talking of an assessment that in 5 years, actually, or less than 5 years, would double the assessment of the property. And that would seem quite steep to me. I'm not entirely sure that I agree with the argument put forth by others, Mr. Speaker, that this would somehow tie the hands of the municipalities in terms of raising revenue. And my reason for saying that is that if we were to take a certain stretch of a number of properties, let's say 11 properties, and that these are traditional, long-standing properties within a municipality, and let's say, we want to go, we don't have to go back 100 years, but let's say 50 years, and they have had whatever incremental increases, but not due to any particular spike due to non-resident land ownership, or even a resident coming in and purchasing one at a particularly significantly higher level. So we know that the municipality would certainly count on a predicted revenue from those 11 properties, and if one of them is sold at what we'll call a spike, then certainly it's going to get its predicted revenue from 10 of them, and it's going to get the next year it's going to get its significant revenue from that other one, and so in that regard, the municipality really could plan on a higher revenue from those 11 properties than it previously would have expected. And the only difference is that if it assessed the other 10 at the same level as the one that caused the spike, they would not be able to receive that additional revenue on the 10. But I think that most reasonable people would assume that if that one property hadn't been sold, then they would still on the 11 get the smaller predictable revenue, and in this case they're getting a somewhat higher revenue. And so I can't in my own mind make a case that or support the case that there's actually affects their ability to generate revenue. It affects their ability to generate that much more revenue, but they would have a predictable revenue source as they always have had, and I think could base their expenditures on that as they always have done so. So the issues around land use are important ones. Actually, I'd really like to see the province move in some direction around this issue, in particular, not purely on the basis of non-resident or residential land use where there's a spike in the value of a particular property, but on the whole issue of land use, whether it's agricultural land, forestry, mining, whatever, but that the province actually develops a roadmap around the land use and making the best, not only the best use of land, but the best value for the province and the municipalities in this regard. So with those few comments, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to this bill moving on to law amendments. I'm interested to see what presenters will say in this regard, and hope that something appropriate can come out of this. That would something appropriate will come out of this for the benefit of all Nova Scotians, because if it's not, I mean, my colleagues who are municipal councillors may take a different view, but it would seem to me that municipalities and municipal councillors are elected, and those bodies are there to work on behalf of their constituents, Mr. Speaker, as we are. And with those comments, I look forward to this moving on to law amendments and to see what presentations are made there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I recognize the Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, that's to close debate. So be it. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to be brief. I do want to thank the members for their comments here today and on Friday. As well, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank those who, from the time this bill was tabled in the fall of last year, who provided me with advice and comments with respect to the issue of skyrocketing assessment. I also want to thank the UNSM for the advice and the feedback that they provided as well. As well, Mr. Speaker, the Association of Municipal Administrators offered some input into this bill between the time it went from first reading to second reading as well. So I want to thank those individuals. I want to, though, at this time, take a few minutes to address some of the concerns that were raised during debate. I would point out, Mr. Speaker, that one of the issues raised early on was the fact that this bill will change the approach the province uses to assess properties, and that is not the case, Mr. Speaker. This bill will continue to use the tried and proven approach of market value to develop the basis for assessment. The approach, as I described when I introduced this bill, as I described when I opened debate at second reading, is the same approach that we have used and that has proven effective here in Nova Scotia and across North America, and that is using the market value approach to determining the assessment. That is exactly what we intend to do with this bill. I, too, like other speakers, have had some tremendous experience in my life evaluating real estate, and I do know that it's a system that works. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, our office assesses over 660,000 properties in Nova Scotia. Over the past 4 years, we've seen assessment appeals decline by fourfold, and we've seen our staff, the customer satisfaction rate increased by 75%. So that, to me, would say that we're doing something right here in Nova Scotia. I also want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that the intent of this bill is to ensure that, first and foremost, that Nova Scotians are protected, that they receive the level of protection that their government can afford, and that is a protection that keeps them in their house when they see their assessment increase dramatically. It's incumbent upon their government and all members of this legislature to ensure we do whatever we can to ensure that those people receive the greatest amount of protection. That's what this bill does. Mr. Speaker, issues that have been brought up with respect to Bill number 40. I recall during debate the member for Halifax-Shabukto said that Bill 40 is an act narrow on focus. I would submit, Mr. Speaker, that another bill entitled the exact same title, an act to amend Chapter 23 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Assessment Act, Bill number 9, would aptly be described as narrow in focus. It simply prescribes an amount of which assessment will increase, and no longer from that day on will there be any reevaluation of assessed properties. Mr. Speaker, that's a narrow focused bill. Bill 40 is a bill that addresses the issues and the concerns of the people in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to point out that since tabling the bill in the fall, I've had the opportunity to visit all 55 municipal units. I met with the mayors and the councillors, and I talked to each and every council in this province and each and every county. And without exception, those who commented on both Bill 40 and Bill 9 were clear. Bill 9 is not at all what Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities is looking for. In fact, when I spoke to the UNSM, they were very concerned about this. Now, Bill 40, I would say, is an approach that reaches some kind of compromise and enables municipalities to continue to offer a high level of service and protect their tax base, at the same time protecting the interest of Nova Scotians from skyrocketing assessment. I would point out, Mr. Speaker, that members opposite have spoken in favor and opposed to this bill. It's my expectation and hope that they will work with this legislature and with all parties to ensure that all Nova Scotians get a bill that works for them. That's our goal and that's our objective, Mr. Speaker. I'd also point out that there have been several attempts to try to resolve this very complex issue. The one thing that I've heard in this legislature is that this is a complex issue. That is absolutely factual. It is. And our attempt to resolve this, I believe, is the most prudent attempt of those that have failed, and I think it's one that will see the approval of those people who have been affected by skyrocketing and dramatic increasing assessment. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of Bill number 40, an act to amend Chapter 23 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Assessment Act. Thank you.
Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour say aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill 40, entitled an act to amend Chapter 23 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Assessment Act.
And the bill is now referred to law amendments for future day. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Sure.
I recognize the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations on an introduction.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today in the gallery opposite, we have with us visiting from Middle and Upper Sackville, Scouts and leaders from the 6th Sackville Scout Group, and I'd ask them to stand and receive the warm welcome from the members of the legislature.
Very good. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, I move now to the House to now rise to meet again on the morrow, the hour of 12 noon, and the House will sit from 12 noon until 6 p.m. The order of business after question period, Mr. Speaker, will be public bills for second reading, and we'll be commencing with Bill 46 and then going through as numbered in the order paper. So, Mr. Speaker, I move the House now rise.
Okay. Is that agreed? So, House is adjourned.